We now move on to our next session. Since March 2020, we are passing through a difficult time. Pandemic has touched our life in one way or other ways. Was there anything that we have learned from this difficult time? I'd now like to introduce our distinguished invited speaker, the leading neurosurgeon of this country, Dr. Chatterjee, Professor and Head of the Department, Neurosurgery, Vivekananda Institute of Medical Sciences, and Academic Head, Neurosurgery, Berkeley, Kolkata. He will be delivering his talk, Lessons Learned from the Pandemic. I invite Dr. Chatterjee on stage and request him to deliver his talk. Over to you, sir.
Namaskar. Honorable President of ISI, Honorable Chairman of the ISI Council, Honorable Director of the ISI, dignitaries assembled here, students, staff, friends. It gives me great pleasure, and indeed I treat it as an honor to be able to share with you this joyous occasion of the 91st birthday, a historic day in the life of an historic institution. I am well aware that no form of statistical surveillance can put me on the same level of scientific significance as some of the people assembled in this auditorium. And since as a professor of neurosurgery, I will confess my knowledge of statistics can be written behind a minibus ticket, I have informed the director I would rather talk to you about lessons that you, the human race as a whole, has learned from this terrible pandemic that we're still passing through. And I'm going to talk to you for the next 10 minutes by my stopwatch on lessons that we've learned as a member of the human race, lessons we have learned as a member of the scientific community, and lastly, lessons that we have learned as members of the medical profession. What have we learned as a human race? I think we've learned the 3 H's: humility, human values, and home. Humility is the most important thing that we've learned as members of the Homo sapiens species. When Professor Darwin told us some years ago that the Homo sapiens was the most evolved specimen to inhabit this planet, little did we think that a brainless blob of RNA would bring us as a race down onto our knees, as it has done for the last year and a half. The second H we've learned is human values. We have learned the most important value of life. We have learned to distinguish between our needs and our requirements. And we have understood that what we require is not what we actually need, because we have learned over the last few months how we can do more with less. We no longer need to travel across the world to give lectures in different parts of this planet, thereby making more holes in the ozone layer than our race has created before. We no longer need to go to shop in expensive malls. We can do with very basic necessities, as we've learned right across this planet in the last 18 months. And finally, the third H we've learned as a lesson as a human race is home. We've stayed at home, but most importantly, we've learned the value of home. Those that stay with us at home, who we had little time for before. And we've also learned how we can still do most of our work from our home. Perhaps that doesn't apply to neurosurgeons like myself. I wish we could operate on brains and spinal cords remotely, but I think still most of you have done a fair amount of your work from home. The second group that I'd like to talk to you about is lessons we've learned as a member of the scientific community. And I think as members of the scientific community, we've learned not the 3 H's, but the 3 D's. And the 3 D's I'd like to talk to you about are digitalization, discrimination, and dare I say, devastation. Digitalization, of course, is something that we've all learned, whether we liked it or not. Those of us with a lot of gray hair, those of us with no gray hair, we've all been reduced to being on the same level field in terms of digitalization, because that's been our only mode of communication with the rest of the world. How comforting it has been for me in a meeting on a digital platform to see a friend of mine from New York City. It is almost like shaking hands with him and embracing him in a public meeting. We've also learned strange things, like giving lectures, wearing a coat and tie with shorts underneath, because that was beyond the purview of the camera of the laptop. And somebody alluded to this, and it just reminded me of this. We've learned discrimination. The most important discrimination we've learned in the scientific community is to understand what should be our priority in a pandemic. As members of the scientific community, we've learned that we now have to do science, research, progress for mankind, not what we need to do, but what we need to do for the rest of the race. And finally, devastation. We've learned to cope with devastation. I do not think there is anybody in the audience who cannot recall a dear one that we have lost to this deadly virus in the last few months. And for those of us that have had an opportunity, and I say opportunity because it is in many ways a God-sent opportunity. Those of us like myself that have had an opportunity to work in a COVID hospital and have seen those young bodies wrapped in black bags being dragged away by a corporation vehicle, will never forget the value of life and will never cease to appreciate that what we have to do today. And as I always tell my students, and somebody talked about this a short while ago, remember, between lamentation about what we did not do yesterday and hope about what we will have to do in the future, there are the opportunities that lie today. First, grasp them with both your hands. And that is something we have learned in the pandemic. And finally, what have we learned as a medical professional? We've learned the 3 I's. I is something I tell my students never to use because it doesn't put us in the right frame in this world, because medical professionals should never say I, we should always say we. But the 3 I's we've learned, and I hate to tell you these 3, but are the I for incompetence, the I for inadequacies, and the I for irrelevance. The first I we learned was incompetence. We had no clue what we should do. We had people delivering newspapers, and we instructed people, don't touch the newspapers, leave them out in the sun for 12 hours or 24 hours, so read yesterday's newspapers tomorrow. We covered ourselves with sanitizers. We now know that most people except the manufacturers of sanitizers have not benefited from their use, because the virus travels only through the nose and the mouth. And what you do to your hands or your head or your feet makes little difference to whether you can get this disease or not. And therefore, that was the incompetence that we had till we learned. There were those of us who were doing surgery, wearing those horrible protective equipments, the PPEs, which were not sterile. So on top of that, we were wearing another sterile gown, 2 masks, 2 headgears, 2 gloves. And if you had to do that and operate on a human brain for 7 hours, at the end of that exercise, I can tell you, most of us were much more sick than our patients were. And we needed dehydration and a shower before we could even think of doing the next operation. We learned, of course, that that was useless. Of course, we learned our inadequacies. We learned how in this very country of ours that we love so much and which has institutes like yours that we respect and honor so much, in this great country of ours, we didn't have enough oxygen. Imagine a country that can send people to space, that can compete with the best in statistics, in IT, in science, not having enough oxygen to save our own people. That was what we learned in terms of inadequacies. And I hate to say this, but I will confess, the last thing we learned in the pandemic is our irrelevance as a profession. And as we watched people break all sorts of medical advice to attend political or religious rallies, or go and look at tall pandals in this city, while doctors stored their hair thinking, why don't they listen to us? We realized that for science to succeed in practice, you first need to convince your political masters and have the political will, rather than have doctors, medical professionals, and science just expound the theories of science. I will not end on a sad note, so on a happier note, I will say that when you're in the 90s in cricket, you have to be circumspect. You have the advantages of having batted for those 90 runs, and you have just 10 more to go to reach that target, which puts you right on top of the world. But you know where you have to go, and you know where you have been. And since I don't often get invited to 91st birthday parties, I will tell you that you have to borrow from cricket this information and work towards those last 10 runs with great care and precision. And finally, to conclude, what is the most important lessons we have learned from the pandemic in this life? I think the most important lesson, and I'm sorry for misuse of a statistical jargon, the most important principle we've learned is what I call the odds ratio of life. We have learned that we have to strive and continue in spite of the odds. We have to continue our work and not wait for the odds to end. We have to, in this new odds ratio I define, we have to learn to get even with the odds before the odds can get even with us. Thank you very much. No.
Can we take one question?
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Chatterjee, for your illuminating talk and wider perspective concerning the pandemic. So let us take one short question from the audience. Just due to we are running out of time, so just one question.
Decompose the pandemic. Just thank you for how to decompose that the failure was because of the medical reasons or social reasons, social awareness.
I think I don't want to derogate or allocate, I should say, responsibility to any particular group. I think we failed as a race. And I think we failed as a species. We have taken all precautions. We've spent millions and millions and millions of dollars to prevent a third world war, which could decimate our race. We have failed to spend that amount of money in research in virology, in research in public health, as a species. And I'm not referring to a state or a country here. And I think it's a failure on all fronts.
Thank you, sir.